Welcome, aviation aficionados. I'm Jamie Beckett, AOPA's You Can Fly Ambassador in Florida. It is Tuesday, July 26th, smack dab in the middle of the biggest aviation week of the entire year, because this week, way up north there in Wisconsin, we're doing AirVenture. And because we care, the ambassadors have taken the hit. They have traveled to Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Not me. I've stayed at the home base because I love you people. But my peers decided they would do what needed to be done. And we've got a man on the street report. Pat Brown actually flew up there himself. Pat Brown, tell the story of going to AirVenture 2022.
Well, your man in the street is actually your man in the basement right now, because that's the quiet part of the house. I've got a bunch of rowdy buddies upstairs that are making barking noises you can probably hear. At any rate, we left the house this morning. I left the house this morning. We were airborne by 8:30. Short stop in Jeffco at Jeff City, Missouri for some lunch and gas. And we had an instrument approach in there, had to file to get out. Pretty phenomenal instrument conditions, but we still needed to file to get in and out. And then a short 2.5-hour flight from there to Fond du Lac, is where we flew today. So we had just a little bit over 6 hours of actual flying time, burning about 14 gallons an hour in true airspeed, 164 knots. Ground speed was never less than about 170. So we had a little bit of tailwind, and we beat the airlines with time to spare. So
how many folks are in the airplane with you?
Say again?
How many folks did you have in the airplane with you?
We had a total of 3, me and my partner in the airplane and a good friend of ours in the back seat, telling us what we were doing wrong.
So not only were you faster than the airline, you were probably cheaper based on the number of people.
Yeah, when you divide it up by 3, we were probably at or right at probably what it would have cost to fly in. And the thing about it is we flew into Fond du Lac, and if we'd have flown airlines, we would have either have to go to Appleton, Milwaukee, or Chicago, and or Madison, or someplace like that, because there's no airline service into Whitman Field and no airline service in Fond du Lac. So we landed really within about a 20-minute drive where we're actually staying, and again, taxied right up. They were waiting for us. Basically jumped out of the airplane with the cars and up to the house, and now we're gonna go get some food and stock up for the next several days and have a great old time. It was an awesome trip. I would highly recommend it for anybody that wants to. It's a piece of cake getting into Fond du Lac, and we just had a blast. It's just a great weather. VFR on top for part of it, IMC a little bit, not nothing real tough. Instrument approaching to Jeffco and VFR all the way from almost all the way from there to Fond du Lac. So great flight, great.
Well, fantastic. Pat, I can't thank you enough for taking the hit and going to AirVenture. It's got to be a burden, but thank you so much for doing it on behalf of the audience. You really are an ambassador, proving that general aviation, in this case, was faster, cheaper, and way more fun than the airlines ever could have been.
Yep. And so somebody had to do it. Kay and I had to do it. Jamie, I'm disappointed in you didn't do it, but somebody had to.
Anyway. One of us has to be boring, and that was me. I lost the coin toss.
Well, you were anything but boring, my friend. Hey, listen, I'm going to sign off here because I'm hearing noises upstairs like they want to go get some food. So I don't want to be left behind. See you later.
Oh, hey, go ahead. Thanks,
right,
Pat. And Pat doing a great job. But Pat was actually preceded at the show by my fellow ambassador from Southern California, Kay Sundrum. Kay did fly in commercial, so she had a very different experience, but she was on the ground all day yesterday, opening day, and all day today, and she's coming to us straight from the EAA Museum. Kay, tell us a story about what you're seeing over there at AirVenture 2022.
Well, good evening. I am at AirVenture. I'm actually sitting in the EAA museum in their lobby here. They're actually closed at 6 o'clock, but they were gracious enough to let me stay here for a few minutes so I can chime in and say hello to all of my friends on Ask an Ambassador. So I arrived on Sunday, and yes, I flew commercial and into Chicago, took the train down, and I've tried, all different types of transportation to Oshkosh. I've been coming since, let's see, my first time was in 2002, and I have come every year except for 1 year, and then of course in 2020 when we had the pandemic. And I will say that the way that Pat arrived, GA is my favorite style of getting into Oshkosh, but that's not always practical. And so this time I flew to Chicago, came in, and it was uneventful. A little airline delay, but not a big deal. But at Oshkosh, wow, it is just a phenomenal event. And I think a lot of people really missed it in 2020, and a lot of folks didn't come back in 2021. So this year, I know a lot of the hotels and lodging around here are oversold. They were oversold a few months ago, and I can see it on the ground. It's really busy. I spent yesterday in the exhibit halls. I only got to two of the four. I didn't even get to go anywhere else around the grounds. It was a great time to do your Christmas shopping in July, all your aviation gear. I buy that right here at Oshkosh. And then today I had the privilege of being a part of EAA's pilot proficiency program, where I joined the Art of IFR was the name of the workshop. I took the afternoon half workshop and got to go in the Redbird simulator, combined with some ground classes taught by some phenomenal instructors. Earned this little coin right here for completing that program, and I'm heading out to see some other friends tonight. And every day there's a whole bunch of activities going on, a lot of aviation safety seminars, and of course the air show, all the celebrities that you meet, and just incredible pilots. And it's a reunion for me. I got pilot friends all over the country, and I get to see them at this reunion every year. So it's a really special treat for me.
That's fantastic. Kay, thanks so much for telling us the story. I hope you have a wonderful time while you're there. I hope you take a little bit of time to go over by the Brown Arch, where I understand there's a little campus there for some outfit called AOPA, and they might have something worthwhile to share with people. But thanks so much for being there and giving us a little bit of a tour of the museum. Have fun this week.
Thank you. There's a museum behind me, and you know what? They're locking up, so I got to get out. But thanks, Jamie, and I'll listen to what you have to say later tonight.
Fantastic. You take care, Kay. Hey, for those of you watching, let me know in the comments if you've ever been at AirVenture or if you're at AirVenture now, because I know there's people like in Camp Bacon and variety of places where folks camp out and hang out, and they just might be tuning in and watching us. If you've ever been up there to Wisconsin for this remarkable show, which is hundreds of thousands of people, thousands of aircraft, workshops. The 1 week wonder is back, I believe, where they'll actually be building and flying an airplane in 1 week. It's pretty remarkable stuff. Now, there is one unfortunate somber note that we have. Well, no, that's not true. There are two somber notes where we start off this AirVenture. Yesterday, we found out Tom Poberesny, former EAA president, son of the founder, Paul Poberesny, passed away, and we are very sad about that. Tom was a good guy, led the organization well, used to actually fly in a 3-ship aerobatic routine. Tom was the real deal. So we are sorry to see him go. And just today, we found out Dave Higdon passed away. Dave was a fixture at AirVenture, Sun and Fun. He was based out of Kansas. Not somebody that all the attendees necessarily know, but anyone who writes about aviation or does video production about aviation knew and benefited from their relationship with Dave Higdon. So Godspeed to both of them as they go west. I will miss both of them very much. Now, topic for tonight, we're talking about common errors, but you know, in its simplest form, when you get right down to it, flying is incredibly simple. A kid can fly, and I know this because multiple times I've let small children fly an airplane. I mean, 8, 10 years old. I do the takeoff and the landing, but they can fly the airplane just fine. So tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about how there are some common errors that might prevent you from flying as well as you want to, but it really isn't that tough. And these are all things we could learn fairly simply to be better pilots. Now, of course, as Rebecca, my producer, Rebecca Boone, best producer on this program. I mean, no disrespect to Donnie, but he's not here tonight, so he doesn't count. Rebecca does an outstanding job, so I hope we all give her a hand at some point. In any case, as Rebecca just pointed out, I'll answer any question you've got. Anything that occurs to you that you're thinking, hey, this might be interesting, I'd like to know Jamie's perspective on that. Even if you want to know Pat or Kay's perspective, we'll find it for you. We'll find a way to get you an answer. And of course, if something occurs to you after this broadcast is over, feel free to write to us at ambassadors@aopa.org. Ambassadors with an S, because there's 3 of us. We will collectively get together and come up with an answer for you, and we will be perfectly happy to do that. It's not an imposition. It's what we do. So let's talk about pitch. And of course, by pitch, I mean this, up and down, aircraft pitching up and down. It's kind of a misunderstood thing, which is a shame, because pitch has kind of an automatic control that is underutilized in airplanes. Most general aviation airplanes, almost all, at least have elevator trim. And when we pitch, we should also trim. I recently saw a comment online where somebody was writing in that their instructor had suggested they don't use trim when flying in the traffic pattern. And I couldn't understand that at all. The traffic pattern is a fairly high workload environment, especially if you're doing just pattern work. We take off or we're at high pitch, high power, low airspeed. Then we'll level off. And I wish I had an airplane on the desk here. Oh, wait, I do. I have the official foam AOPA seaplane. So when we take off and we pitch up, we're at high power, high angle of attack, but relatively low airspeed. We're at VX for best rate, or VY for, I'm sorry. We're at VX or VY. So best altitude over a distance, best altitude over time. Then we're going to roll over, pitch over into cruise flight. And that means our speed is going to start to come up. Our angle of attack has come down. And it's going to take some pressure to keep that nose down. Then we're going to get ourselves into the pattern where we reconfigure the airplane as before we turn base, where we start dropping flaps. Maybe if we have retractable gear, we're putting retractable gear down. We're going to start doing things to the aircraft. All of this is going to affect its ability to pitch and how much pressure it is. And really, that's all the trim really does. Trim removes the pressures, so we're not having to manhandle the airplane. It doesn't require John Wayne level pressure to get in there and fight the airplane around the pattern. We can use trim to remove almost all the pressures, which is why we're just controlling the airplane very lightly. We don't need this big death grip on the yoke in order to get around, or the stick. It doesn't really matter which one we're using. Pardon me, hydration is very important. Now, this is especially true in IFR flight, where precision is fairly important, and we need to hold our altitude within 300 feet because we're on an IFR flight plan. Being able to pitch over, as we climb, pitch over into a cruise flight, and then set the airplane up to fly appropriately, just hands off, at a given speed, at a given angle of attack, it just makes sense to use pitch. It's a very simple thing, but much underutilized. So it's something we want to really get good at. Now, one of the things that's misunderstood about trim, and maybe part of the reason why it is underutilized, you're actually trimming for an airspeed, not an boy, what a night. You're actually trimming for an airspeed, not an attitude. Let me show you what I'm talking about. As I fly along, and say I'm in my spectacular Cessna 152, So I've got, say, 2,400 RPMs on the tack, and I've got 90 knots on the airspeed indicator, and I've got my trim wheel down here just by my right knee, unless I'm in the right seat where I normally sit, then it's by my left knee. And I'll just turn that trim wheel to remove most of the pressures. Now, I can get the airplane to fly hands off. So hands off meaning it's just maintaining this attitude, and it'll maintain that 90 knots at 2,400 RPMs just as I set it. But I didn't really set it for the altitude or the attitude. I set it to hold that airspeed. You can test this yourself when you're up flying. Let's say I'm cruising along at 3,500 feet, cross-country altitude for a flight that I'm going towards the east, someplace between 0 degrees and 179 degrees. I'm at 3,500 feet, and I'm in that exact situation. I am flying at 2,400 RPMs, and I've got 90 knots. Now, if I pull 200 RPMs off and get to 2,200 RPMs, I'm not going to stay in this attitude. The nose is going to drop. It's going to actually drop a little farther than it needs to, and I'll get up more than 90 knots, and then it'll rise up a bit. And it'll keep oscillating just a few times until it finds 90 knots. Now I'm just going downhill at 90 knots because that's what I trimmed for. If I push the power back up to 2,400 RPMs, the aircraft, which is headed downward slightly, will now pitch up a little bit too much actually. And it'll start to slow down below 90, and it'll nose down until it gets above 90. And after a few oscillations, it'll settle right down again at 90 knots. And if I decide I want to get that altitude back, all I have to do is push in the throttle, and there I go. I'm right back into it, climbing up at the same 90 knots, because that's what I trimmed for. That's a misunderstood thing that people think they're just holding an altitude, but they're really not. And it's just such an important thing because over control is so easy. Bill Santos, welcome to the party. It's good to see you. Here in Trigger Gap, Arkansas, Bill says, we have a problem with loud, low-flying nuisance aircraft. It started when the Recreational Aviation Foundation opened an airstrip. Pilots aren't obeying the rules. Bill, I'm sorry to hear that. The Recreational Aviation Foundation is a terrific group. I've been out on some of their campouts before and terrific. I'm wondering where that strip is and which rules specifically we're talking about. I would encourage you, if you have a problem, contact the regional representative of the Recreational Aviation Foundation. They really are a responsive group, and while they want backcountry strips open, they are not trying to annoy the neighbors. So if there's a problem, bring it to their attention directly, and let's see if we can get a resolution. And if you can't, feel free, or if you don't know how, or if you're uncomfortable doing it, feel free to write to me directly or write to ambassadors@aopa.org. We'd be happy to address that problem. We certainly have contacts at the Recreational Aviation Foundation. And you know, problem solving is a big part of what ambassadors do. We have no problem making a phone call, writing an email, going to see somebody and sharing a cup of coffee and say, how can we fix this? Because almost everything can be fixed. Great comment, Bill. Thank you very much. And I appreciate you bringing it up, not just letting it fester and get the neighbors all cranky. Now, I was just starting to talk about over-controlling airplanes. It's a big problem, especially with newer pilots. And part of the reason is, let's say that's the yoke or the stick. And what will generally happen, an experienced pilot will fly like that, 2 fingers and a thumb. Just add a little pressure, take a little pressure away, add a little, take a little away. That's it. A new pilot will fly like this, and they will squeeze until their knuckles are white because they're nervous. It's normal. That's a perfectly reasonable reaction to flight training where you feel like you're under a lot of pressure. You're trying to control the airplane. You're hearing all this static on the radio, people talking from all different places. Your instructor's giving you instruction, telling you to do a variety of things. And just, it feels like the workload's building up and building up and building up. So you are holding on with your entire hand. Here's the challenge with that. When I use my whole hand, I'm using all these muscles as I control the yoke on the aircraft. And it's very easy to over control at that point. As a matter of fact, we'll see this sometimes on final when a student is working on landing and it's just all over the place on final. It's up and down and left and right and banking, and they're fighting it, and the student is sweating, and they'll finally tell the instructor, I just can't take it anymore. It's way too gusty. I need you to take it. And the instructor says, okay, I've got it. And when the student lets go, it just stops. It just smooths right out. It's called PIO, pilot-induced oscillations, and that's exactly what it comes from. If you're using your entire hand, or worse, two hands, you're using so much muscle on that yoke or stick, you can't even feel how much pressure you're applying or how frequently. It's back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and left and right. It's just out of control. Try this simple trick. Use a pencil or a pen and just kind of weave it between your fingers like that. So it's just between your fingers. It can be way back there, or it can be out at the next joint. That's going to force you to just use your thumb and finger, because if you start to squeeze, it's going to hurt. And that's going to remind you, oh yeah, I don't want to do that. Just go for those two fingers and the thumb on the yoke of the stick. That's all you need to control the aircraft. Cam Smeltzer says, pitch, power, and trim. That's what my instructor has drummed into me. He has me use trim extensively at all phases of flight, so there is never force on the yoke. Cam, it sounds like you've got a good instructor. That is exactly what it's for. You don't want to fly the airplane with trim, but you do want to remove the control forces. And as you move into higher performance aircraft, you'll notice it's not just elevator trim. There's also rudder trim and aileron trim. So you can control the aircraft on all three axes, and sometimes that's necessary, especially, World War II fighters, for instance, single engine aircraft, left turning tendency is left turning tendency, and they'll have significant rudder trim because it takes a lot of pressure to keep that thing going in a straight line. So outstanding, Cam. Hats off to your instructor. Mike Roberts says, hello from Maryland, moving to the Florida Keys in 6 years. That's some serious forward thinking, Mike. I can't blame you. I happen to love the Keys. There are two public airports there, Marathon and Key West. Key West has become much more commercial oriented than it used to be 25, 30 years ago. But you can still fly in there with a GA airplane. And of course, there are a number of private strips too. And it's a great place to live. I wish you the very best, Mike. I hope that's a great experience for you. Now, we were talking about pitch, and we were talking about trim. Makes all the difference if you have a beverage. Why would we pitch up when we roll into a turn? Or should we? And yes, you're right, Mike. Summerlin Key is a very nice airport. If you're going to be living in Summerlin Key, I'm a huge fan. I'd like to become your best friend. I actually know a couple guys down there at Summerlin Key. Terrific people, beautiful place, and of course, you're right near the water, so you can have a car, a motorcycle, a boat, and an airplane all on the same place. I wish you the best with that. You're going to have some fun. So why would we pitch up when we're entering a turn? Well, let's go back to my little AOPA seaplane again. As we fly straight level, all our lift is vertical. Everything the wing is producing is pulling us upward. We have a positive angle of attack, whether that's just a couple degrees, whether it's 10 degrees. We have a positive angle of attack, and it all pulls upward. But when we roll into a turn, some nifty science happens. We have some vertical component of lift, and some of that becomes horizontal component of lift, which pulls the airplane through the turn. The rudder yaws us in that right direction to overcome adverse yaw, because this high wing has more drag than this low wing. So the airplane actually wants to skid around the opposite way. The rudder helps us with that. But since some of our total lift has been swapped to horizontal, we don't have as much vertical lift. So the steeper the bank angle, I'm just going to throw that on the floor for now. The steeper the bank angle, the more we have to pitch up to maintain altitude as we go through that turn, because we have swapped that vertical lift for horizontal lift. Still have vertical lift, just not as much. So there's only two ways to increase lift. We can go faster, or we can increase our angle of attack. Now, accelerating through a turn isn't very practical, but we can increase our angle of attack as we roll into that turn, and when we come out on the other side, we can reduce that angle of attack. Now, if you're a student pilot doing steep turns, 45-degree bank, 360-degree turn, you actually might want to use the trim wheel there, or the trim crank, depending on which your airplane has, and do a little bit of nose-up trim as you roll into that turn, and get rid of a little bit of nose-up trim as you roll out of that turn, just to make your life easier. Christopher Ritchie says, my instructor had me put the airplane into slow flight, clean, flaps up, gear up, then switched it over to slow flight, dirty, flaps and gear down. What would happen in slow flight, dirty, if you just raised the flaps? That is a great question, Christopher. It is an aerodynamic thing. In slow flight, we're flying along, relatively straight and level, and then we bring our throttle back and we start slowing down. But we want to maintain our altitude, so as we just said, we can go faster or we can increase angle of attack to increase lift. Well, we're slowing down because it's called slow flight. So as we slow down, we have to increase our angle of attack to keep that airplane level, keep it at that same altitude. Incrementally, as we do that, we drop the flaps. Now, the flaps give us more lift and more drag. Let's talk about a Cessna 150, 52, 172. They have, at 10 degrees of flaps, it adds a lot of lift, not much drag. By the time you get to 30, or in some older models with the manual flaps, 40 degrees of flap, it's a lot of drag and not much lift. So it takes power to keep it up at that altitude with that kind of angle of attack with full flaps. Normally, we take those flaps out incrementally so we can make that change to increase speed and lower angle of attack incrementally. Pardon me. If we just flip the switch and knock the flaps all the way up, we would have to transition to level flight much quicker, but we would not speed up that rapidly. So we would lose altitude. Not an enormous amount, but it's a perfectly safe thing to have to try out, Christopher. So when you're with your instructor at the pre-flight brief before your lesson, why don't you tell your instructor, I'd really like to see what happens if we're in slow flight and we just retract the flaps. Not a bad thing to do. Get to a reasonable altitude. Me, I'd be at about 3,500 feet AGL, because you don't want to end up below 1,500 feet above ground level when you complete any maneuver, and that's in the Airman Certification Standard. So I'd have enough altitude there that I have plenty to play with, a couple thousand feet. And get yourself established in slow flight clean, see what it feels like. Incrementally bring in the flaps, see what it feels like slow flight dirty when you're nice and stable and everything's good and you're communicating with your instructor and they're ready for it. Go ahead and pop the flaps up and see what happens. Now, on electrically actuated flaps, that's going to take a few seconds. So you actually do have some time to react to it. On the older Cessnas or Piper Cherokee series where the flaps are manual, that's going to be pretty much instantaneous. You're going to notice a big difference. But of course, we practice stalls too, don't we? So the solution, worst case, drop the nose. Lower your angle of attack. That'll help you build airspeed because now you're going downhill. And this is not part of the Airman Certification Standard requirements where you have to do slow flight and retract all the flaps at once. So you really will learn something out of the experience. And I admire you for thinking creatively. That's a great one, Christopher. I really do like that. I asked earlier, by the way, is there anybody who's been to AirVenture or is currently at AirVenture? Just put me in the comments. If you've ever been to AirVenture or if you're currently at AirVenture, just pop a me in there or wave. It'd be really interesting to see if anybody watching tonight is sitting campside by the fire, roasting marshmallows, seeing what's up. Now, power and airspeed are connected. I know that seems weird because it's not always true. If I point the nose down, I can gain a lot of speed and not use any power, right? Well, kind of. Gravity is power too. It's just not under the hood. It's a force in the world. So angle of attack is going to be a factor for us, and speed is going to be a factor for us. But it is something we need to understand it, but we don't need to get so bunched up on it that we can't really think about it, because it's like lift. We'll often talk about lift is the upper surface of the wing is curved and the bottom surface of the wing is relatively flat. Bernoulli's principle tells us the air going under the wing has a shorter distance to travel, so it'll be a higher pressure than the relative wind going over the wing, lower pressure, so that provides lift. That's true, but that's not all of it. There's also, we're at a positive angle of attack when we're flying level or climbing, and the wind is hitting the underside of the wing and deflecting downward. That also provides lift, and you can demonstrate that yourself driving in the car down the road. You put your arm out the window very carefully because you don't want to hit a mailbox or another car going the other way. But if you have your hand like that and you can put in a positive angle of attack, your hand will rise. Put in a negative angle of attack, your hand will descend. It's the same thing. Your hand is not a very efficient airfoil, but it does get the impact pressure of air hitting it, that relative wind, and it makes all the difference in the world. Fred Northrup says he has been to AirVenture a few times. I am with you, Fred. I'm sorry I'm not there this week, but somebody's got to hold down the fort, and it was my turn. It is a great place, though. I've stayed in a house there. I've camped there. Either one is absolutely fantastic. And if you, I mean, you know, because you've been there, it's an amazing experience. And what really surprised me when I was there camping, I didn't meet many pilots in that section of the campground I was in. I did meet people who had been there year after year after year, which just goes to show there are some real aviation fans out there who don't fly. They don't even want to fly, but they like the technology. They like the people. They love the I don't even know what you'd call it, the brotherhood, the sisterhood, the community that comes with all these people who have just one common interest. It's a pretty cool thing. Rev1LG says, haven't been to AirVenture yet, but hopefully soon. I hope you get there. It is just fantastic. And Rev, you're on YouTube. Mike Roberts on Facebook. Thank you for both platforms being in here. But yeah, AirVenture is absolutely amazing. And I'll tell you, if you haven't been there, but you've been to other air shows, prepare yourself. It is on a whole different scale. And you've got to give props to Oshkosh, Wisconsin. That entire town gears up for this. And it is a remarkable thing that everybody in town recognizes that this is an opportunity to help the EAA and themselves. It's mutually beneficial. The hotels are full, the restaurants are packed, gas stations are selling fuel and Slim Jims and Diet Cokes, and everybody gets into it. I was at dinner one night there, and the woman who was waiting on us worked during the day in a coffee shop and at night in the restaurant and did double shifts through the week, and her pay was huge. People even go on vacation during this week to rent out their house to companies or visitors coming to AirVenture because it's just a really lucrative deal, and it provides housing well beyond what the hotels in the area can do. Connor Wilder says, this is my 5th year helping out at AirVenture. That might be the big story, to tell you the truth. And this is true at all fly-ins, certainly true at Sun and Fun, my local fly-in, which is the second biggest aviation event in North America. It literally takes thousands of volunteers, thousands upon thousands of people who travel great distances, donate their time, participate to do all sorts of things, from being line service workers to selling tie downs or renting tie downs, emptying the trash, being the follow me people on motorcycles so aircraft follow them to the correct parking places. It is absolutely amazing. They sell tickets, they do security, they handle parking, they run the campgrounds. Volunteers do everything. And because there are so many of them, there's always room for another one. So if it's something you want to do, just like Connor is doing for the 5th year, thank you, Connor. They're the people, the unsung heroes, that really make this work. And my hat's off to you. It's fantastic. Fred says, it is incredible. I camped out every time once in the ultralight section for the Kit Fox anniversary. That's the thing, that there really are different sections. There's ultralights and warbirds and classics and the aircraft that are produced by the major manufacturers, you know, the Bonanzas and the Cherokees and the Cessnas and just all kinds of stuff, and the kit manufacturers and the plans built people. There's a helicopter section. There's everything. There's no way you can have the slightest interest in aviation and go to AirVenture and say, yeah, there was nothing there for me. Because the truth is, it's just overwhelming. There is so much there. It's incredible. You got to go someday. I hope you do. I hope you have a wonderful time when you're there. I really always have. And I kind of envy Pat and Kay because they're up there this week having a time. Let's talk about bank control. Bank. I'm not talking about the bank where your money is. I'm talking about banking the aircraft. Seems like the simplest thing in the world, right? Push the stick over to the left, turn the yoke over to the left, the plane just banks. Nothing to think about it. Well, sometimes we're making a 90-degree turn, or we're on a check ride and we're doing a 180-degree turn and back again for S's across the road, or a steep turn where we're doing a 360-degree turn. And for that, we might use 30-degree bank, or in a steep turn, 45-degree bank. But what if I'm flying on a cross country and I realize I've drifted a little bit off my course and I only need to correct 10 degrees? Am I going to roll into a 30-degree bank to make a 10-degree heading change? No, I'm not. Am I just going to stay straight and level and kick left rudder and skid my way over there? No, not a great idea, because now you're cross controlled. I know it doesn't seem like it because your wings are level, but doing that, you're just skidding across the sky. Not really the best way to go about this. Beg your pardon. We want to think about how much bank do we need for the correction we need. This is especially true for those IFR pilots shooting an approach or holding. We're not going to make some big dramatic change. We're going to make a relatively modest change because we're trying to change the trend of the airplane. We were departing off this way and we don't want to. We want to go this way. So it's a relatively minor change with a very small bank to bring us back to where we want to be. And when we get there, we may blow through that line and make a very small change back. The key to flying well is very often the realization, I'm going to make hundreds, thousands of very small changes, which is why I say you're not really pushing the stick, pulling the stick, yanking it around. You're just adding a little pressure and something happens, and then you remove that pressure. Adding a little pressure, I've got a little bit of a left turn going, a little bit of left rudder, a little bit of left stick, and then I neutralize it again. It's all about adding and taking away pressure. Very coordinated, very calm. There is never a case where we just have to freak out. And it doesn't matter if that's something fairly dramatic like a steep turn, or even if we do a simulated engine out. You're still flying. If the engine fails in a single engine airplane, it just means we're landing now. Because we've got gravity. It's just like riding a bike. If I'm riding a bicycle and I want to go uphill, I'm going to have to pedal really hard. I'm going to have to put a lot of effort in this because I'm trying to move weight up an incline, exactly like this airplane. Instead of a ramp, it's just sky, but still, we're on an upward incline. We need a lot of power. When we get to the top and we get to the altitude we want and we level off, or if I get to the top of that hill on the bicycle and hit flat land, I don't need to pedal nearly as hard to maintain speed, and that happens in the airplane too. We can bring the power back a few hundred RPM, and it'll still fly along just fine and faster than it was flying uphill at full power. Now, on the other end of that, if we decide we need to descend, we don't need any power to descend. Now, normally, at a normal descent, we will carry power because on an air-cooled airplane engine, we don't want to shock cool it. We've been flying along for an hour. The engine oil is heated up. The engine has acclimated to the higher temperature. We're in cooler air. Even in the summer, it's cooler air up there. We don't want to just close the throttle and dive down. All kinds of air moving over the cylinders. It's going to cause that metal to contract very quickly, and that's shock cooling. We can have an engine failure. We can crack a cylinder. There's all kinds of bad things that can happen. So normally, we're just going to retard the throttle a couple hundred RPMs and maintain more or less the same speed as we just gently come down. But if our engine failed, shock cooling's not our big issue now because the engine's dead. We don't know why it's dead necessarily, but that's not our concern. We now need to make a landing, assuming we can't restart it. We need to make a good off-airport landing. So that's why I say, if we lose our engine in a single-engine airplane, we're just landing. Think of it that way. I'm picking the best spot I can see in front of me, to the side, below me, behind me. What's the best place I have to go? And I go there. But now, just like the bicycle going downhill, I'm using gravity as my power source. And if I've got altitude and I trim for best glide speed, remember the trim thing? We're going back to trim. I don't have to be fighting the airplane, and I'm not diving at 110 knots and then pulling back and trying to preserve some altitude. I just, in a very organized fashion, I trim it for best glide speed. In a Cessna 152, that's going to be 60 knots. And I'm just going to glide while I'm looking around. I find the field I'm going to go to, the road, the parking lot, the desert, whatever it is. I pick that out, I commit to it, and I do a normal landing. But there is no point where I'm wrestling the controls like they do in the movies, or something crazy happens. It's just not the way it works. It's a much, much more organized thing than that. And this brings us to maybe the greatest problem students and pilots have, in my humble opinion. Do I have you on pins and needles now? Fixation. Fixation is a real issue. Mike Roberts says, what happens at full yoke left and right deflection? I have never in my career done a full left or right deflection, Mike, in the air. I do on the ground when I'm making sure that controls are cleared, but full deflection is really not necessary. I mean, unless you're doing aerobatics, but I have never needed full deflection for anything. It's just not necessary. But we're talking fixation. What I mean by fixation is staring at one instrument or staring at the panel to the detriment of everything else you're doing. I've told this story a few times. I think I've even written a couple articles about it, but it's a good example. I had a student once who was just a terrific pilot. His problem was he was an engineer, and I'm not slighting engineers, but one of the challenges I've always had with engineering students who are engineers, they drill in on the panel. That's where the numbers are, and they're data people. They want to know what's there. And I was flying out of an airport, Meriden Markham in Meriden, Connecticut. It's got one runway, 1836, and when you're headed to the north, Meriden Mountain is about 1.5 miles away, 1,200 feet. And my student and I took off on runway 36, perfectly good takeoff, and he was making real good progress towards earning his certificate, and eventually did earn his certificate. He became a very good pilot. But we're taking off and we're climbing out, And I asked him, I said, is everything looking good to you? He says, oh yeah, I'm right on my airspeed. I've got my climb rate. I'm on my heading. Everything's great. Are you sure nothing troubles you? Everything's really good? Yep, I've got everything right where it needs to be. And he's just looking at the panel. And he's right. All the numbers are right on. He is right on VY. He's holding runway heading. He's got a nice climb going, 400 feet a minute. Everything's terrific. So I had to say, does this big hunk of granite out front bother you at all? Because we weren't going to clear it. And that's what made my student pick his head up and look outside and realize everything that can hurt you is outside. He was fixated on the panel. Important information, but not information that's so important I can ignore everything else. We'll see this especially in IFR flight, where students will tend to fixate, or not just students, any pilot, given a problem, given a situation where they're starting to have a real workload and they're trying to resolve a problem, like I'm losing altitude, they will tend to drill in on the altimeter, not the attitude indicator, which gives pitch and roll information. They're just looking at the altimeter, which is just telling them how high they are. It isn't giving them pitch information. It's not giving them roll information. It's not giving them power information. It's just telling them the altitude above sea level, which isn't always that helpful because the altitude above sea level does not relate directly to your altitude above ground level. Those are two different numbers. Even here in relatively flat Florida, there are places where we have towers over 2,000 feet. So if you're flying at 1,500 feet and not looking out the window, this could be a real problem. Fixation is an issue. We'll even see it now that GPS is just ubiquitous. Everybody has something on their phone, something on their iPad, something in the panel, and we're just following the magenta line. We're not thinking in 3D. We're not thinking about our altitude. We're not thinking about our fuel quantity. We're not thinking about anything. We're just following the magenta line. And then when something goes wrong, maybe the engine starts to vibrate. Maybe the weather closes in when it wasn't supposed to. Maybe my passenger starts getting sick. And I don't know where I am on that line. I just know I'm on that line. I have no idea where I can go from here because I haven't thought about it at all. I haven't been actively engaged in flying the airplane. I've just been fixated on that magenta line. We need to really be on guard for that because, frankly, fixation can really bite you. We need to have a scan. And the biggest part of our scan, especially VFR, but it's still true IFR, collision avoidance. And I'm not just talking about airplanes. I'm talking about towers, flocks of birds, mountains. There are things out on the other side of our windshield that can be very harmful to us, and it is not reflected anywhere on the panel. We need to keep our head up and out. And yes, when we're flying instruments, those instruments give us lots of good information, but we still have to have collision avoidance on our mind. So if we're not in the clouds, if we're not in IMC, we should be eyes up, looking outside at least part of the time. AirJ PIC says, what's a good rule of thumb when it comes to VFR rules? What percentage should you be looking outside instead of the cockpit? I suppose there's an FAA guidance on this, AirJ. I'll tell you, for me, I'm outside probably 98% of the time. I will look inside to make sure I'm holding my altitude, to make sure I'm on my course, to make sure my power is set where it's supposed to be. But I do that kind of like I look at the speedometer when I'm on the highway in heavy traffic. I just look down very briefly and right back out. It's no more than a second or two. Everything that I need to know is outside that panel. I can pretty much hear my power, so I know I'm in the ballpark. I can see my altitude, and I know I'm trimmed up. So while it will vary over time, especially as I go in on a long flight, as I get into other pressure areas, and I'll have to reset the altimeter, but that will affect the performance of the airplane to some degree. I am almost entirely outside. All the things inside, airspeed, altitude, power setting, oil pressure, oil temperature, those are all things I can pick up in just a second by shifting my eyes and looking right back outside. And I don't have to get all of it at once. I'm looking outside. I've got a scan going around from one side to the other side. I'm looking up, I'm looking down. I might even be looking below to see if somebody's climbing up below me, especially if I'm flying past another non-towered airport where there might be somebody who doesn't have a radio or just doesn't want to use the radio coming off the ground and climbing up. I want to have a good idea what's going on. So I am almost entirely outside. There's never a point where I look inside and I check my airspeed and my attitude and my altitude and my tap and the oil pressure and the oil temperature and make sure the radio frequency is right and how far to my destination. And then I look back outside. Way too long inside for me. I want to be up and out most of the time. Great question, though. It is a great question. I really like it because it's the simple things. It's the basics that we really need to review and think about. By the way, I will tell you that years ago, I was on a cross-country flight with a student going to Stewart, New York. Big airport. They had Air Force C-5s there. Terrific place. I really liked it. But as we were approaching the New York, Connecticut line, there was a Cessna 310 coming right at us at our altitude, and he never budged. We had to take evasive action, and I knew that guy's head is inside. He's looking at charts. He's I don't know, maybe he's got an onboard microwave and he's got a hot pocket in there. Whatever it is, he was not looking outside for a good 40 seconds as we were converging, and we had to do something. And he went right over the top of us, never budged. So I know he wasn't looking outside. That's a bad thing, because while mid-airs are rare, mid-airs happen. And it happens because one of those guys, at least one of them, is head down inside. And it's easy to do. We have things to program. We have notes to make. We have things to read. No, just keep your eyes outside. You can raise your chart up so that you can look at it and still have the outside in your peripheral vision. You can raise your iPad up so you can see it and shift your eyes back and forth. You don't have to be heads down. Mark Weller says pitch equals airspeed given a constant power setting. Power equals climb or descent given a constant pitch. You know, that's an interesting point, Mark. I'm just working with the new face. I'm sorry. I don't always pronounce things right. There is a connection between pitch and power, and we'll often talk about it. And you'll have instructors who will talk about power on an approach, pitch for airspeed, power for altitude. Well, that's true. There's also the backside of the power curve. So you can go either way, but you are right. Climbs happen because of an excess of power, not an excess of lift. In a climb, believe it or not, when we increase our angle of attack and power to climb, momentarily there's a big increase in lift because of the angle of attack. But as we switch from going this way, let me get on the camera, this way to this way, there's a short period where the relative wind is coming from here and our angle of attack is increased. But very quickly, our relative wind starts coming from here. And we have relatively the same angle of attack, but we have excess power. That's what causes us to climb, excess power. But as a general rule, Mark, I'll go along with that. Pitch equals airspeed given a constant power setting. Power equals a climb or descent given a constant pitch. I'm going to go along with that. I like it. Mike Robert is back. Did you ever fly out of Fort Meade, FME, when it was a military airport in the Fort Meade Flying Club or with the Naval Academy Flying Club? I did not. I've flown over Fort Meade, Florida. Fort Meade is a relatively rural thing in the south part of Polk County, right in the center of Florida. It's a beautiful place. I really like it down there. There's some interesting restaurants and little parks and things like that. But no, I never flew out of Fort Meade. I have flown out of Wauchula and Arcadia, which are just south of there, and certainly Bartow to the north, but never out of Fort Meade. Air J says, how many times have I landed on the green dot at Oshkosh? A total of 0. I will be honest with you, just my buddy Pat, who flew from Texas to AirVenture today. And yes, if you were here at the beginning of the show, he beat the airlines. It was cheaper and faster for him to fly in a, man, it was cheaper and fly. Last try. It was cheaper and faster for him to fly with 2 friends in the Comanche from Houston to Fond du Lac, Wisconsin than they could have done with the airlines. I have never flown into Oshkosh and never intend to. Similarly, I fly into Sun and Fun every year, generally with an AOPA plane, sometimes with a couple of AOPA planes on different days, but I always finish up the day before the NOTAM goes active. I'm confident that I can fly in there with the NOTAM active. I certainly, it's Sun and Fun. I know the area. I fly here all the time. I have every confidence I could do it the Fisk arrival at AirVenture. No big deal. But that many other pilots weirds me out, because it's not that I don't trust my ability. I'm not sure I trust the other people, especially when we have people who are taking that attitude that you don't want to trim in the pattern, or that you need to look into the panel more, because collision avoidance is a huge deal. It's just my thing. I respect the people who do it, but I have not, and I'm not gonna. Jennifer Johnson, who, by the way, has a really nice hat. Jennifer Johnson does have a really nice hat. I'll tell you the story someday. Can you explain or demonstrate slipping for airspeed? Probably not, but let me give it a try, Jennifer. I do not slip for airspeed. I'm coming into land, right? Just like that, over there, DC-3 behind me. I'm coming into land, and I do this a lot, by the way. I have a Cessna 152 as my company car. I generally land with no flaps or only 10 degrees of flaps. It's very rare for me to use 20 degrees or 30 degrees of flaps. I have long runways to deal with. I don't need all that flap. So what I'll do is no flap landing. I'm coming in and I'm a little higher than I want to be. And that's intentional. I'd rather be high and fast than low and slow. It's just a thing I do. If I've got 5,000 feet of runway in front of me and I only need 800 feet, I'll touch down a third of the way down. I'm not aiming for the numbers. I'm not that guy who's going to land short. So I'm coming in and I'm a little bit high and I'm a little bit fast. So what I'll do is I'll put the rudder one way and I'll put the wing the other way. So I do cross the controls. Now, here's the thing to be aware of. On my Cessna, the static port is here. So when I put the rudder in to present the left side to the wind, the static port is getting some ram air pressure, which means the airspeed indicator is wrong. The comparison between the pitot tube and the static has been compressed. It's reading a little lower than it should. So I go a little faster. Instead of approaching at 60, I'll approach at 70 or even 75 if I've got gusty winds. I want to make sure I'm going to be okay with that. But that will give me the drag of the fuselage in the airstream. It will give me a very, very significant descent rate. And then as I get down to where I want to be, I can pop that out and the descent rate stops. My speed bleeds off pretty quickly too, because remember, that was an erroneous reading. Of course, I have the opposite problem if I go the other way. My static port's on this side, and I'm presenting this side to the wind, which means there's a little bit of a vacuum on the static port. So the pitot is giving ram air pressure, but the static port is giving less than the actual pressure. So my airspeed indicator is reading high. So I want to be aware of that as I slip in. But yeah, I don't really slip for airspeed. I slip for altitude adjustment. And for me, it has always worked. I liked it. When I owned a Piper Cub, which has no flaps, that was really my standard thing, because I don't want to aim for the numbers and be short, especially if the engine sputters or it loses power. I'd rather aim 500 feet down the runway and just slip myself down there. For me, it's always worked really well. And Jennifer agrees. It is the coolest hat, and she looks fabulous in it. She really does. Jason S., I'm going to guess that's Jason Shapper from M0A. Can't be sure, but I'm thinking that's who it is. Jason S. mentioned this in a video, slip to land or slip for airspeed, but not both. He confused me on the slip for airspeed. Jennifer, I'm not really familiar with that one, but I will talk to Jason about it and see what he's thinking, and I will get back to you on that, because that's a really great question. As I say, I've never slipped for airspeed, but slip is a great thing to have in your back pocket, because you could have a flap failure someday and you want to be able to get it down and slow it down. And you can, that slipping, you can, because you're presenting all that drag, you can slow the airplane down fairly quickly. What if you have static ports on both sides, Fred says? Then you don't have a problem, because they'll equalize. They're taking static pressure from both sides and coming through to one tube. So Fred, if you've got a 172 or something that's got static ports on both sides, you're good to go. There's also the possibility of an alternate static source. Now that's inside the airplane, so that will read at a slightly lower pressure than outside the airplane, but it's something you can depend on. Folks, I have had the best time dealing with you today. I really have. I enjoy doing these more than you know. I do miss Pat and Kay. They are my good friends. They are my peers, my fellow ambassadors, and we really enjoy what we do. But they're just having to rough it at AirVenture this week. So please remember, thank you, Rebecca, for popping up that email address. I have the best producer going. Right, ambassadors@aopa.org with any question you've got. And I mean anything. If you want to start a flying club and you don't know how, if you want to buy your first airplane, if you're thinking of taking flying lessons, if you're wondering how you finance moving up to an instrument rating, whatever your question is, it does not matter. Write to us. This is what we do. We are more than happy to help. Jennifer, thank you for the compliment. Great learning session. Great audience participation. That's a big part of this. Your questions really make this work. Makes the time fly by, and I just have the best time. I'm going to be back here with Pat and Kay on Tuesday, August 9th, 7 o'clock Eastern, 4 o'clock Pacific. You do the math in the middle. You're smart people. You can do it. Until then, do me a favor. Share this video if you can. If you're on YouTube, you can copy the link. You can press the like button. If you're on Facebook, go ahead and click share. And make sure you put in there in your comment, just say, this changed my life. These ambassadors are incredible. It's completely revolutionized my thinking. I'm going to assume that's true. Folks, thanks a lot. I really do appreciate it. See you right back here on Facebook and YouTube on August 9th. And until then, fly safe, have fun, and just keep learning. You all have a great night.